I mean, the other thing that was exciting was I think everyone in the room had, we were all full of React Kool-Aid. Like there was no.
Hello and welcome to React Native Radio, Episode 1. Today we are joined by Kevin Old.
Hello, everyone.
Jed Watson.
Hey, everyone.
Lee Johnson.
What's up?
And my name is Nader David. Before we get started, everyone introduce yourselves and tell us a little about yourselves.
Hey, everyone. My name is Jed Watson. Been using React for a while and recently React Native a lot. So excited to be part of a podcast where we get to talk specifically on this topic.
I'm Kevin Old. I've used React for a while as well, and I have prototyped React Native app for use in a larger group of apps. So I'm just drawing on the community's experience at this point and learning what I'm finding about the mobile landscape.
Cool. My name is Lee Johnson. I have never used React. I'm actually a mobile developer, came across React for some multi-platform development, and we've kind of fallen in love with it. So exploring it from the mobile viewpoint.
Cool. My name is Nader David. I'm a software developer for a company called School Status and located in Madison, Mississippi. We develop software for schools, mainly K through 12. We do everything from web development to right now we also have a React Native app that's in production, and we are currently about 4 months into it. Mainly my background is front-end development, and usually out of the front-end development that I've been doing, mainly it's been web. I also run a couple of local meetup groups here in town. Also, I'm a co-founder of a company called Code South Labs, where we teach coding to entrepreneurs, students, and just anyone really who's looking to learn how to code. So
cool.
So basically, for our first episode, I think we're going to go ahead and get started into how you can get going learning React Native coming from different backgrounds. Most of the people on this show today have different experience with different things, and we all kind of have a unique perspective on developing with React Native. So I believe we should all have good experience explaining our backgrounds and why we think React Native is good. So Kevin, how did you get started with React Native?
So I was at ReactConf in January, and that's where they announced React Native. So I received early access to it. All attendees did, and immediately was really intrigued because I'd played with the Cordova-based, and I wondered what they brought to the table. After initially looking at it and trying to wrap my head around concepts I didn't know, I put it down. The things I didn't know were those iOS-specific things that an iOS developer would know. And a few months ago, the idea came up in our company it was actually a question, is React Native viable, right, as an option to produce an iOS version? And then we know that React Native for Android would be released later this year. What would that look like? And would that ecosystem be something we could adopt since we are building a React-based app? So I spent a week or two playing with the code base that we had built initially that had a Flux implementation with React components. And we were actually able to reuse most of our code actually all of our actions and Flux architecture from that web application on our React Native prototype for iOS. It was absolutely awesome. And so now our goal is to, finish developing the web version, and then we'll have a chunk of code that's going to be reusable with the web and then with 2 versions of mobile apps on 2 different platforms. So yeah, the initial draw was, at first I got amazing access to it, but then I didn't have a use case at the moment. And so throughout the past few months, that use case has come up. So that's kind of what's drug me into the space.
Well, that's cool. Jed, how about yourself?
Well, I've got a long history of building mobile apps, and React's been the drug of choice for a little while now at my company, ThinkMill in Sydney. And, I was at the React conference in January with Kevin as well, and we just launched a mobile app framework with React called Touchstone.js, which did I still like to think, a really good job of providing a native quality user experience in web view using React. And we were loving that, and I showed up, and the only person from I think probably the side of the world in that room, and they dropped React Native on us. I'm like, oh my God, this changes everything. So that was pretty interesting to sort of take into account and just work out where the stuff that we've been doing with pushing hybrid forward as a technology fit with what Facebook were pushing forward with hybrid as a technology. Ended up by sort of June at React Europe having reconciled the two viewpoints a lot and sort of understood, where hybrid as in web tech still fits in the context of a native app, and where it's really great to be able to sort of blend those skills into developing, I guess I'd say, a more native app with React Native, and where that sort of bleeds into then what I'd probably have to call, like, I call it native at work, but, sort of, I guess, platform native apps with Objective-C or Swift or Java on iOS and Android. So we're sort of coming at it from, web devs turned mobile devs turned slightly more native mobile devs. But we do a range of apps. We got a number of clients from startups to larger corporates that we build stuff for. So yeah, it's been really interesting, and we've been adopting probably more of a balanced blend of using React Native as well as the hybrid technologies to deliver the stuff that we do. So
I know the community was very much behind React Native after it was announced at the conference, but you being at the conference, how was the initial feedback of React Native with all the devs that were there?
I think one of the really interesting things was a talk that Netflix gave about the way that they'd taken React and replaced the rendering engine for Netflix as it's embedded on devices, basically saying like they started with the DOM and the DOM was too heavy, and they were able to basically use the virtual DOM abstraction to replace that. The way that fit in with the context of what Facebook had done with React Native was really interesting. It was quite a different take on what you can do with a web framework that we haven't seen with things like jQuery or MooTools or YUI or any of the like view layers that have come before. I think everyone was pretty blown away by the implications of what they were seeing, being able to use React to build these really fluid, highly performant UIs with easy access and bridging to lower level features on the device. And really everyone was there was a serious buzz in that room. It was pretty special, and we just couldn't wait to get our hands on it and see what we could do with it. And I think that excitement hasn't let up. I mean, the level of engagement from the broader community in React Native as a thing compared to React itself has been huge. So
I think it was just
Kevin.
Sorry, I think it was the same thing. It was more of seeing the possibility of another layer that we didn't know you could do something with React, right? So it was almost, I don't think they had to sell us as much because we had already understood what you could do with React. And then they just kind of said, oh, by the way, if we remove this platform dependency, just like you mentioned that Netflix, the talk with Netflix and how they did that. And these days we're seeing the fruits of that labor in React 14. With the removal of React, the DOM portion from React. So I think that in my mind that day was about, oh wow, this isn't just on the web, and this isn't just for these things, and it's not similar to any of the Cordova-based web wrapping pieces that we're used to. This is something completely different. So that was really exciting.
I think in the way that React sort of takes this concept of like, let's approach the problems that we've always had with UI development on the web, and let's go back to some fundamental assumptions and challenge those, and then see what we can do that no one's really tried to do yet. React Native feels like the same approach being taken to mobile development. And we've seen a few other things pop up since then, like NativeScript from Telerik has come up with a different kind of bridging layer that runs in JavaScript core. But I mean, the other thing that was exciting was I think everyone in the room had, we were all full of React Kool-Aid. Like there was no issue selling anyone in that room that React was an exciting thing. Being able to then take that understanding of how to create user interfaces and how to write apps and being able to apply it to a completely different platform is really exciting.
Absolutely.
And I guess from there, as with this being such a new technology relative to some of the other stuff we've worked with, I know everything moves so fast these days. How does everyone feel about when they first started picking up React Native? How hard was it to get your first app up and running? And also thinking about more deeper level fundamentals when you're building a larger scale application, how hard do you think it was compared to some of the previous experiences you have, say, building hybrid or native apps, picking up React Native, and what roadblocks and things like that did you guys run into?
Oh man, it's easy to get started. that one-liner to create yourself an app and then enable developer tools and live reload and just start editing code and seeing your changes. Like, it must take about, well, if NPM was fast, it would take like 20 seconds, right? Mm-hmm. And then you can just press play in Xcode and run it on your device. So that's really easy. I think that then the things that catch you up are the things that look the same but are actually different. Like, how do I navigate? Using the navigator or working out how to structure an app without something like a React Router as a crutch is a bit of a learning experience. And not just a crutch in that there's a great framework there that we're used to being able to use, but we're also used to things like URLs. Okay. You don't really have URLs in native apps. Well, they'll come. But, particularly in the early days, like these patterns of navigation and application structure, all of a sudden it's like back to basics. And the other thing that catches you up is the way that the Flexbox is implemented, the way styles are implemented. It looks deceptively like CSS. It's fundamentally not CSS. And you've got to sort of not let yourself fall into the trap of forgetting that you don't actually know what you're doing unless you're reading the docs. That was sort of the main challenges that I found and my team found getting into it.
I agree. Getting everything started for me was fairly easy, but once you get into some of the styling issues, things that looked really easy seemed a little tougher than I would have expected. But a lot of the actual framework-specific things about routing and navigation, the docs seem to be pretty good so far, and there's a lot of stuff being added. You can go to the web page one day, and then the next day there'll be 3 or 4 new items there with a lot of new documentation. So I think just doing a couple of tutorials online, running through those, and just going through the docs, I think after about one day of playing with it, you can get a very good grasp of how to build an app with React Native.
Yeah, so for me, it was the same initial, wow, this thing is set up in a few minutes. The things I did struggle with, though, were some concepts. So I was not familiar with the Navigator iOS concept or concept of just how that works from a native, and I'm trying to say a native iOS developer or an initial iOS developer, whatever the term is there, for someone that is not using React Native. The way that they code the Navigator with a push and pop kind of mentality and transition, that was new to me. So it took me probably a day to come up to speed with that and understand how we were trying to progress through our application. But once, I will say that I had the benefit of working alongside an iOS developer who understood all of those. And so it was really nice to be able to share with him all the React parts and the Flux parts and, open his exposure to that area and have him show me what the iOS specific items were. So I think that those initial learning curves were there. But other than that, the Flexbox wasn't a big deal for me. The docs were really well written on that, and there are several. CSS Tricks has a massive guide on understanding Flexbox, so that was a huge help. And then the feedback is just so quick, and you're able to iterate just like you are on the web apps. So you do something wrong, and then you immediately fix it. So.
Can you go into a little bit about the debugging experience in React Native and how it's similar or different than some of the web stuff that we're used to?
Oh yeah, so I mean, it's just when you launch the tool, it launches an instance of Chrome, and you've got the Chrome debugger, where you're seeing everything that you were used to. Of course, in ours, since I had the initial Flux app, I was seeing all my Flux events for when we requested the initial load of data and we fired off some initial actions to get our list running. It's actually, you can interact with those just like you do any other application. Yeah, it's pretty straightforward. And you hit the play button and then it just pops up.
Yeah, that definitely is one of the things that help move it along at the beginning and throughout the whole development cycle, being able to see it that quickly. Coming from a native world, not having to watch that thing compile and wait for the simulator to redraw it is huge. And I know there's a playground now. I've never really gotten into it that much, and you can do little things, but playgrounds at this scope are kind of difficult. But I agree, the Flexbox was our biggest hurdle, just because it's not like auto layout, but I think it's what auto layout should be. And there's no visual tool for it. At least in native development, you have a visual tool of auto layout, and you can kind of see what's going on. With Flexbox, you're flying blind, just like you would do with CSS. We tried some of the online Flexbox simulator tool things, but they never really quite line up. But once you get Flexbox, then your speed increases dramatically on what you can do and how you can do it. And then obviously seeing it real time is pretty awesome.
I will jump back in with the Flexbox and the styling. It's reminded me that so at React Europe, Michael Chan gave a talk on inline styles, and that's kind of it's not necessarily a controversy in the React community, but keeping your styles in your JavaScript, it can make people feel uncomfortable because you say you have hundreds of less or Sass files or just regular CSS files. What does that mean, that you have to rewrite all of that in your React components and break it up? It doesn't mean that at all. But that whole controversy or topic, I had not approached it, but React Native gave me the first exposure to having my CSS via Flexbox in my components. And I love it. I absolutely love it.
I think it's a lot easier to do with React Native as well, because there are no unanswered questions.
Sure.
If you're putting your styles and your components in the web, then you've got all these other concerns to deal with, like, what about, am I bloating my source code? Is this good for SEO? How is this going to deal with media queries? Like all these things. And obviously we're answering them as a community, but when you're starting with React Native, particularly 9 months ago now, when a lot of the solutions like Radium and JSS weren't as mature as they are now in the React web world, it doesn't matter. It's really liberating to be able to play with styles in your JavaScript and know that this is actually how it's meant to work, and there are no drawbacks to it. There are no gotchas. I think the thing that's probably caught us up about using this sort of custom CSS implementation that they developed was more around what wasn't there. We're used to blending a whole lot of web techniques together, and particularly coming from like a hybrid mobile app heavy background where you can use Flexbox or you can just center something. You're used to the way that CSS styles are inherited through divs and spans and inline and block level elements, and like everything behaves a particular way, and you get used to the tricks and hacks that you can use. And sort of every situation you look at, you're like, I know 10 ways I could solve this. In React Native, there's much more likely to be one way that you can solve it, and you got to solve it that way. So that was probably what sort of, was why we had to keep thinking, no, wait, this isn't CSS. I got to stop thinking like it's CSS. I got to start just like reading the docs and using what's there correctly, and not relying on, 10 years worth of intuitive understanding of the way that browsers lay themselves out. But Ali, I'm really interested in hearing your getting started experience as well, coming from the opposite end with native development.
Yeah, it's weird hearing you guys talk about how easy the transition from React to React Native was. I'd never used React. Well, I'm actually the opposite. We're now looking at React for web work because we like React Native so well. But I come from mobile development background using iOS predominantly. It's very much an iOS first, doing iOS before Arc existed. But that multi-platform is the holy grail, always has been, right? Everybody wants to do multi-platform, so you save development resources and get the great experience. I think my first multi-platform app was for Sencha Touch, way back in one of the first versions. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Sencha Touch, but at the time, it was one of the only things you could do to get that native-like transition, JavaScript files. I mean, it was real JavaScript, not a bunch of rendering tricks. And it worked great. It was in the App Store for a couple years before it was rewritten, and no one knew it wasn't native. And we did a lot of iOS apps. At the time, I was a consultant for a large consulting firm. We did government works. We did a lot of iOS government apps. TSA, one of them. There's some TSA apps floating around out there. But then we're still trying to do multi-platform, just especially because where I work now, Nat and I work together at School Status. We have a small development team, and it just makes sense to utilize your resources. So we have one app out there now that's a Cordova app. It's Angular Cordova app, and it's an iPad application, and it works great, and it handles a lot of data, and it's used every day in classrooms all around. But you can tell there's just something off a little bit. So when we were doing our new app for a much larger audience, we wanted something that was really native, but we don't really have the resources. I think I'm the only one that has an iOS background. We have somebody who has a touch of Java. So we just really don't have the resources to develop this great app in 2 different languages. So we started researching it. And I will mention, some of you guys noted about the React Native. One thing you see out there as kind of controversy is Appcelerator, right? They did it first. They were here first. So nobody's mentioned it, and this may get edited out. But so we actually reviewed Appcelerator at my previous job, looking to move to that for development because for the same reasons, multi-platform. There's a native render there, but there's a lot of bloat, I guess, to how you have to do it. There's so many, if iOS do this, if Android do that in your code and in your rendering, and it's just dramatically different than anything else. It's very customized. So getting ready for this review, that I actually did a NativeScript tutorial and was going pretty heavy in that direction because of what it does. It takes JavaScript and an XML type markup and renders the native. I was like, well, that's a really great idea. I mean, ideally, I want to write all of my logic in JavaScript and do the rendering in something native. That's really what I'm after. That's, I think, the ultimate for today's tool set. And NativeScript kind of did it. And then jumping into React Native when it was announced, and I didn't have a React background, so I probably heard about it last because your React guys knew stuff was coming. And it had the layout and the good parts that NativeScript had and how it approached it. But the way that it did it was just, to me, cleaner and easier to understand. And the styles in line for a mobile developer aren't a big deal. We don't have CSS style sheets in iOS that we use. There are some pods that you can get to force that if that's your thing, but it's normal to style a component. So it wasn't really a controversy for the mobile standpoint, so much so that we're looking at using React Web for some projects, and there's actually an NPM that allows you to use React Native type styling exactly for the web. And we're looking at going with it because it's just nice to go to that one place, have your layout, have your logic, and have your style in that one place.
As of this recording, React Native for Android was released about 2 weeks ago. Has anyone played with React Native Android, and what kind of environment is needed for that? Do you just need to have the Android SDK downloaded on your machine?
Yeah, I wouldn't say I've gone further than playing with it, but more poking gently, actually. But yeah, you need the the Android SDK installed, and then there are command line scripts that you can run in React Native to actually launch the emulator or launch it on a device, basically.
Okay, so you basically run the Android emulator and it debugs in Chrome just like the iOS does?
Yeah.
Cool. I'm going to have to take a look at that.
Yeah, and you'll immediately, we're doing it now, and you immediately run into some gotchas. Like, for example, we purposely did not use Navigator iOS for this reason, right? We use just the Navigator object, and that's great, but we are storing some security elements in Keychain, so immediately it doesn't work because Keychain doesn't exist in Android. So you run into platform-specific things, and because Android is so new, there's not always a direct Android version of that NPM you're using, which is kind of exciting. It means maybe you can contribute to that.
It's kind of fun getting involved in the early stages. I mean, the whole thing's really new. I ran into this huge, completely snookered myself last week trying to lay out an iPad app in React Native where we wanted the navigator inside a modal. And we just had this thing that should take up about 70% of the screen size, and you navigated within it like a smaller version of an app, and immediately found that the navigator was had hard-coded values in it that laid out the buttons relative to the detected size of the device. That was out. Maybe I can use Navigator iOS temporarily to hack around this. And then I found out that if you embed Navigator iOS inside a modal, it crashes in like the worst way. Just Xcode.
Yeah, that sounds bad.
Hates itself. So I was like, well, I could solve this if I did this, or I could use this instead. And yeah, and like I can't actually, like none of these paths lead to the cheese. And I'm, just in a maze. But I mean, the flip side to that is it was really easy to just grab the code for the navigator itself and take the navigator navigation bar and, create a local copy in my project and invoke that instead and start just changing the way it detected its size and, hopefully contribute back to React Native when I've worked out a good way to implement a dynamic layout for that. So yeah, it's maybe not if you can't afford a few speed bumps along the way, but then you kind of get a lot of benefit from it as well. So I'd say that overall, a lot of things were a lot faster, and then every now and then you hit these things, you're like, all right, well, I got to get my hands dirty here. And it's kind of like you get to actually engage with the project as it's being written. I find that really exciting.
Yeah, I do too. It feels like you're kind of in the wild, wild west of the wild, wild west. Everything is just so new. I mean, you if you wrote a blog post or if you wrote some documentation for every hurdle that you had to overcome on your own, we would be writing a lot of documentation because there's so many things that seem to come up. But overall, most of the roadblocks that we found have been fairly easy to overcome, or we found some type of answer from the community or something like that. So we've had a great experience so far.
And I will note that it's not the rendering engine that Facebook released is not the issue. Like anybody listening worried that, it sounds like it's not ready. That's not the issue. The rendering engine we have never really had a problem with. It's you're going to want to do things that haven't been done. Right? It's a new technology. You're going to do layouts. You're going to do things that have never been done before, and getting to figure that out is really where this comes from. We haven't run into any issues with stability or rendering problems or all that. It's been really great. It's just it's actually possible to be the first one to try to do it that way, which is awesome.
Yeah, and it's often not a huge cliff you fall off when you do hit something that you don't know how to do. If there's not a blog post, and at this point I think 9 months on, there's a lot of information out there about how to solve different problems. And there's kind of an escape hatch. You could always drop a UI web view in, just a web view in and render some HTML if you need that. If you want some canvas for a particular reason, you can do that. And, if you want to use a native component, then you can do that as well. The bridges, I think coming from a Cordova background, particularly, the simplicity of the bridging interface has been a huge benefit to React Native because it's not as seamless as something like NativeScript, where they're actually introspecting all of the native classes and wrapping them for use in JavaScript. There is a layer of abstraction there, but it's so thin that we're seeing so many native components pop up in the ecosystem. There's really a component to do almost anything you'd want to do that's not built in these days. Your camera, vibration. I saw just within the last couple of days some 3D touch stuff popping up.
I'll second that. And the ease of the bridging interface. So our iOS developer for our app, we wanted to engage the camera within our view. So we wanted to take a photo within that, and all that the camera component gives you is the access to the camera roll. So he was able to write a bridge in a few lines of code, and it feels very functional in the fact that you're able to write a native component and via the bridge and access it via the bridge, and only that method that you deem appropriate or methods are exposed to React Native, and then you can just pull that into your component and call it from there. Just via the standard imports. So it just feels very straightforward, in my opinion.
It's very easy. I think one of the things that really helped React in the early days was that there are all these escape hatches when there's something that doesn't exist yet in the framework or something that doesn't exist in the ecosystem. One thing they got right was you had the right escape hatches to just drop out and implement something else. If you need a rich select control and there's no React select yet, that's okay. You can use a jQuery plugin and hook into a component, did mount, and component will unmount, and just directly manipulate the DOM and drop in. It's a bit ugly, but it totally worked. And that helps refactor larger apps to use React as well. You can kind of stick it at any level, like whether you're starting from the inside out or the outside in. It meant there were a lot less blocks to adoption and just trying things or experimentation or gradual progression towards using it. They seem to have gotten the same sort of mentality right with React Native. You can use pretty much any other technique that you could use in native development, I assume. Lee, you can definitely talk to this better than I can, but it seems like you can just implement that and then, you're unblocked again. So,
yeah, I can give you a great example. So we're doing messaging in one of our app, IP messaging in our app, just like iMessage, and using a third party to do it. And they have a pod that does it all for you in iOS. They also just came out with the JavaScript version, but with the pod, you get core data implementation and everything. It's a true native experience. So we were able to include that pod, write the bridge, which is very straightforward and very clean, and implement it just like you would in any iOS application, but with the bridge methods, the way you define them. Now you're able to access it from JavaScript, so from the React Native side, and it's super easy, really clean. Everything's native. Everything's the speed of native. You get core data storage and queries. Been really great.
I feel like one of the things that has really hampered Cordova over the years is the complexity of the way the widget API was implemented and sort of spec'd. I'm sure they had good reasons for doing it the way they did, but you've got XML files, you've got JavaScript files, you've got tons of scaffolding that you need to put in the way. And I think the number of people who found that accessible and actually ended up implementing modules that, used all that stuff was smaller than it could have been. Whereas React Natives is just so there's as little, stuff in the way between React Native and the bridge and the native code as possible. So we've seen this explosion. And some of that's possibly down to the newness and the popularity of the platform, but I really think that a lot of it just has to do with the accessibility as well.
We've gone over a lot of different things, and I think we're going to be wrapping it up here in just a minute. But before we do, I kind of want to go over with everyone as a new person to React Native or maybe even to React itself. What were some of the things that helped you get started or to learn, and just kind of, if someone wants to just jump in today and pick it up, what would your recommendations be? For me, there's quite a few different places online to, learn. There's the Facebook React Native website. There's reactnative.com. When I first started learning, I went on egghead.io. They have a really good tutorial there. It's about 5 to 10 episodes long. I can't remember exactly now, but it really was just a quick overview. It lets you build an app, and it kind of goes over all the fundamental stuff. And that kind of, for me, was a really good way to go. What about you guys?
Yeah, I'll second the React and the React Native stuff on Egghead.io. I point people to that all the time in the community just to come up with React. And I think you may need to, go through that first just to get acquainted with the concept of components. The other thing coming up with React is the Thinking in React page that's on the React website. It's absolutely amazing. And I think that it can take anyone, if they give it a chance and go through it, you spend an hour or hour and a half with it. It will walk you through building a very small React application. It's all client side. It's all in a single file. And you can get the concepts that will take you over into React Native. The docs on the React Native site are actually really well done. And you have to comb through them to get through the examples and items that you need. But those are viable once you know the lay of the land, I think.
Cool. I haven't seen that. I'll have to check that out.
Something that might be worth noting about the docs as well is there's a lot more there than it looks like. Not all of the pages are actually in the navigation. It's really worth the time just sitting there and clicking through everything you can click on, because there's so much there, and like even if you're just sort of skimming it, then when you hit something, you'll remember, hey, yeah, there was this thing that I could go and look at, and I'll find it again and read it and sort of understand how it was written.
And the GitHub button, the GitHub link can be pretty valuable as well. The code is well documented most of the time.
Yeah, I mean, if you're experienced with JavaScript or Objective-C, probably for that matter, just diving and looking at the code, it's not that complicated. I'm not underselling what they've done, but it's structured in a way that's pretty easy to understand. If you want to know how to use the Navigator component, there's a bunch of methods that aren't actually documented. If you jump in and, it's like just a few hundred lines of JavaScript and you skim through that, and you get a pretty good idea of the API that it exposes. And the example apps, particularly the UI Explorer, are really comprehensive. They'll show you how to use the more complex implementations of the various components that are included. And that's really worth looking through. So something else I'd say, this is more of a philosophy than a particular resource, but just, everyone in the community in React is learning together. We're developing new ways of structuring applications, new ways of coding, practically inventing syntax on the fly. So if you find a good example application or an open source application you can dig through and it doesn't make sense, just move on, pick another one. There's probably something else that's going to be written differently. And as soon as you do find something that you grok, just keep working on it, build a bit more complexity on top of those patterns, and then go pick something else to integrate. Keep an open mind for what's out there. And if you're looking at code and it's not written the way you like, or it doesn't make sense to you, chances are it's just someone's style, and move on and pick something else. And yeah, it's not too hard to pick up. The other thing that's great is looking through a website called react.parts. It's full of all the various different components that people have written. Some of them will be really useful native components, and other things will be native style patterns that have been implemented purely in JavaScript, which will show you how people are using the animated API, or how they're sort of implementing different UI paradigms within components. And that can really help you get your head around it as well. So
cool. I'll have to check out the React.parts. I had not heard of that. But I did hear you bring up the UI Explorer, which is, to me, was one of the best resources. Basically, the UI Explorer is just an app that is available for download from Facebook's GitHub. And it basically has all the different components that you'll be using to build an app. And you can kind of compile the app and go through the code and see how it all works, and delete code and add things. And it's a fantastic place to kind of go and just dig around while you're learning. In addition to what we just talked about, Ray Wenderlich has a fairly extensive tutorial on his website. We'll link to that. TopTool has a good tutorial, and we'll also link to that. And all these have, good GitHub pages. You can kind of go in and dig through this code and compile these and play around with it.
Yeah, and I'll second Ray's site. Ray's site is my go-to for iOS stuff always. When we onboard new developers, that's where I send them for iOS. So that's always first place. I was really excited to see a React Native, because it's kind of out of their typical wheelhouse of native development with some game development thrown in. So it's really great.
Finally, I'll give a shout out to the Reactiflux community. I don't know if you guys are all part of that, but it's fantastic. There's so much help and getting started and experience available on that. A lot of really clever people are using this and have a lot of time for helping other people. So it's a really great community, and I encourage everyone to get in and be part of it. And also, it's probably worth calling out with the examples in the UI Explorer, just in case anyone's wondering how to get that up and running. If you install React Native from NPM, it actually won't be included in the examples folder. The easiest way to get that started is to do a git clone of the React Native repo, and then in that folder do an npm install, then in the root React Native folder, then go into the examples folder, find the Xcode project, open it, or the equivalent Java, open it in Xcode, run it in either the simulator or on a device, and it'll actually run, and it'll pull React Native from the parent folders. So that's the easiest way to actually get that up and running, so you can have a play with it and then start digging through the code.
Well, I think we're going to go ahead and get to the picks, is there anything that anyone else wants to go over before we do? All right. Well, I guess I'll go ahead and start off. There's an author that I've been really intrigued with over the last couple of years, and I just reread one of my favorite books by him. His name is Thich Nhat Hanh. He's a Buddhist monk, and he has a book called No Death, No Fear. And it is, if you're interested in mindfulness or kind of just trying to relax and unclutter your mind, I think it's a really, really good book. And I also just found out that he has a monastery here in Mississippi, and I'm hoping to go visit that sometime in the next couple of months. So I thought that was pretty cool. He's not even from around here, so when I found that out, I was pretty excited. So
I'm going to pick Nodevember, which is a conference I co-organize here in Nashville, Tennessee, taking place on November 14th and 15th. It's a JavaScript and Node conference, and we will have some talks on React Native and one that is using React Native in production. And so tickets are still on sale at nodevember.org.
And Jed's going to be there speaking, isn't he?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'll be there. I'm actually going to be talking on a Node CMS platform that I've been working on with a bunch of collaborators for a few years called Keystone.js, which is possibly at this stage one of the most popular content management platforms out there for Node. So we're really excited to have, at this point, we've nearly finished rebuilding it entirely in React. So we've got some really big plans for where we're taking that UI in the future. So I'm really excited to be just able to go and talk about it with a bunch of other cool people and hear what else everyone else has to talk about. So Kevin stole my pick. I was actually going to call out Nodevember as well. Instead, I'm going to pick a little testing library by Zach, who runs React.js News. It's called Legit Tests, legit-tests if you're Googling that. And I think that's a really nice take on a good API for testing React components. So if you're into tests, and I guess we all should be, check that out. It's really nice to use.
Cool. I guess my pick's going to be the material design document from Google. I've been spending a lot of time in that lately, and what's great about it is, if you're used to the Apple's HIG and human interface guidelines for iOS development, it's very specific to devices, but the material design is not. It actually covers everything from web to devices and puts it in a nice, neat package and explains every bit of it from space to design to color, and it's really, really well done, of course, since Google put it out. So it's been a great read. It takes a lot of time to digest it all.
All right. Well, I think we're going to go ahead and wrap it up now. Thanks, everyone, for listening to episode 1 of React Native Radio. We'll see you guys next week.